The German soldier ran into the American roadblock without a rifle, without a helmet, and without stopping even when warning shots struck the dirt around him, because behind him 2 armed men were dragging another prisoner back toward the forest with rope around his wrists, and before the MPs could force the runner down, he grabbed one guard's coat, opened his bloody hand, and showed a torn list of names already crossed out. The American roadblock had been set across a broken village road after a night of scattered firing, with 2 jeeps parked sideways, sandbags around a machine gun, and medics waiting behind a stone wall for wounded men expected from the east. The soldiers thought the next figures on the road would be a surrender party, but the first German who appeared was running too fast to be under orders. He came out of the ditch with both hands raised, slipped in the mud, and kept crawling forward when warning shots cracked near his boots. His jacket was torn open, his belt was gone, and one sleeve had been ripped where a rank patch had been removed in haste. He shouted the same broken words again and again, begging to be taken prisoner before anyone could send him back. 2 more Germans burst from the trees behind him, not chasing him, but running with the same panic. One carried a white cloth torn from a shirt. The other dragged his left foot and kept looking over his shoulder as if the forest still had a hand around his neck. An American MP pushed them to the ground and ordered them searched. Then the road changed. A shout came from the trees, and 2 armed German field police appeared, pulling another prisoner by rope around his wrists. The bound man stumbled, fell to one knee, and was yanked upright so violently that several Americans raised their rifles without waiting for command. The first runner grabbed the nearest MP's coat and opened his bloody hand. Inside was a torn paper list, folded so tightly it had cut into his palm. The interpreter took it from him and read the first line, then stopped because several names had been crossed out in thick pencil. A shot struck the stone wall behind the medics. The Americans pulled the surrendering men into cover, and the field police tried to retreat into the trees with the bound prisoner. A patrol rushed forward, fired over their heads, and forced both armed Germans to drop their weapons before they could drag the prisoner away. The bound man collapsed in the road. When medics cut the rope from his wrists, they found a number burned into a strip of cloth tied around his sleeve. The same number appeared beside his name on the torn list, marked with a cross, and the word unreliable written beside it. The captured field policeman claimed the men were deserters who had abandoned their unit during combat. The interpreter repeated the accusation, but the first runner shook his head so hard that blood ran down his cheek. He pointed toward the forest and said the fighting was over for them, but the punishment was not. A search of the field policeman's coat revealed a small notebook with names, road crossings, and punishment marks. Several names matched the torn list. Others had notes beside them showing where men had tried to surrender, where they had been caught, and whether they had been returned to officers. The American lieutenant ordered all surrendering Germans separated from the armed field police and moved behind the roadblock under protection. The German officers waiting farther up the road protested that discipline among their own men was still their responsibility, but the lieutenant refused to hand anyone back. The first conflict was no longer ordinary surrender. Men were running toward captivity like it was the last safe place left, while armed Germans behind them carried lists proving that surrender itself had become a crime punished before the Americans could even count the prisoners. Subscribe for more forgotten German POW stories like this one. The surrendering men were taken to a temporary enclosure near the village school, but they did not relax when the wire closed behind them. They kept watching the gate, the trees, and the group of German officers brought in from the road under separate guard. Every time one officer moved, the youngest prisoner stepped behind a medic. The escalation began when the American lieutenant ordered a full medical inspection of the runners. One man had rope burns under both sleeves. Another had bruises around his ribs. The bound prisoner had a deep cut on his scalp and a tag pinned inside his jacket reading temporary custody, pending discipline. The field policeman demanded that the tag be returned as military property. The lieutenant ordered it placed on the evidence table instead. Beside it went the torn list, the notebook, the ropes, and the pistol taken from the forest road. The table drew more attention than the guards because it gave shape to what the men had been fleeing. A German officer with a stiff collar approached the rope line and called the surrendering men criminals. He said they had panicked, endangered their comrades, and invented stories to protect themselves. The youngest prisoner suddenly lifted his shirt and showed a second tag sewn into the waistband, carrying the same officer's initials. That discovery started a fast search. MPs checked the clothing of every protected prisoner and found hidden markings on 3 more men. Some were cloth tags, some were scratch numbers on wooden tokens, and one was a folded warning pushed inside a boot heel. The warning ordered that unreliable men be removed before American processing and questioned at a barn behind the cemetery. A patrol was sent there immediately, taking the first runner as a guide because he knew the path but refused to walk without 2 Americans beside him. At the barn, MPs found fresh footprints, a broken chair, and strips of torn uniform cloth tied to a beam. Behind stacked hay, they discovered a box filled with identity tags that had been cut from German soldiers before they reached American lines. The patrol also found 2 empty cartridge cases near the rear wall. A frightened German cook hiding in the loft surrendered with his hands shaking. He said he had been forced to heat water, carry rope, and clean blood from the floor after field police brought in men accused of planning to surrender. He named the stiff-collared officer as the man who ordered the barn cleared before dawn. The patrol returned with the cook, the identity tags, and the broken chair leg used as a club. When the evidence reached the enclosure, several ordinary German prisoners moved away from the officer group and asked to be questioned separately. The escalation turned dangerous when one German officer tried to signal across the yard with 2 fingers against his cap. A prisoner near the latrine moved at once toward the protected barracks, but an MP intercepted him and found a folded note hidden inside his mess tin. The note listed 2 witnesses to be silenced before night. The lieutenant ordered the officer group confined under armed guard, and the protected men moved to the school building, where windows could be watched. The German officers lost contact with the men they had called deserters, and the Americans began processing the surrender as a criminal investigation rather than a simple prisoner intake. By evening, more men were asking quietly whether protection was real. The roadblock had caught 4 desperate runners, but the barn, the tags, the notes, and the attempted signal showed that the system chasing them had already entered the enclosure with them. The major consequence came before sunrise when 2 German soldiers reached the outer wire carrying a 3rd man between them. They had walked through a damaged orchard all night, following the rumor that Americans were not returning surrendering men to their officers. One had a white cloth tied around his wrist. The other had no boots. The man they carried was barely conscious. His jacket had been turned inside out, and his identity tag was missing. When the medic cut away his shirt, he found the same unreliable mark written on cloth and stitched beneath the collar where it would not be seen in a quick search. The captured officer shouted from confinement that the new arrivals were thieves and cowards. The wounded man opened his eyes, heard the voice, and pushed weakly against the stretcher as if trying to escape it. That reaction was recorded by the interpreter before anyone asked a formal question. The 2 new arrivals identified the cemetery barn and named 3 men who had vanished after being taken there. They said one of the missing men was still alive somewhere near a stone culvert because they heard him calling before field police moved them away. An armed rescue party left at once. They followed the orchard path, crossed a ditch filled with broken branches, and found the culvert blocked with boards. Inside were 2 German soldiers bound with field telephone wire, both alive, both too weak to stand, one still clutching a piece of bread wrapped in American ration paper. The rescue party brought back the boards, the wire, and the ration paper. The ration wrapper mattered because it proved that one of the men had already reached Americans once, received food, and was later dragged back by German discipline squads before he could be processed. The consequence spread through the entire enclosure. Ordinary German prisoners began raising hands from behind the wire, naming friends who had disappeared from retreat columns after saying the war was over. American clerks turned the school wall into a missing name board, writing every report in chalk before copying it to paper. A military doctor examined the rope burns, burned cloth marks, and untreated wounds on the rescued men. He concluded that the injuries came from repeated restraint, not battlefield chaos. The finding was added to the evidence table beside the identity tags and the torn execution list. The stiff-collared officer attempted to protect himself by blaming the field police alone. That failed when the cook identified the officer's silver cigarette case as the object used to hold folded punishment orders. MPs searched the officer's personal bag and found the case wrapped in a towel, with a hidden paper still inside. The paper listed categories instead of names: men who spoke of surrender, men who helped wounded enemies, men who accepted American food, and men who removed insignia before capture. Each category carried a punishment mark, and several marks matched the tags found on protected prisoners. The lieutenant suspended all group processing from that sector. No German officer could identify his own men. No field policeman could move through the enclosure, and no prisoner could be transferred until Americans verified him by face, wounds, tags, and witness reports. The major consequence was immediate and visible. The men who had begged to be taken prisoner now changed the treatment of every surrendering German arriving from the same road. Captivity had become not a shameful ending, but the only shield strong enough to stop their own officers from erasing them. The major reversal began when the youngest wounded prisoner finally woke after surgery and asked for the American medic who had taken the note from his hand. He pointed weakly to the bandage around his shoulder, then to the floor beneath the cot, where a small cloth pouch had fallen during treatment. Inside the pouch were 6 identity tags wrapped in scraps of paper. Each scrap carried a name, a last location, and a short mark showing whether the man was alive, missing, or taken by field police. The boy had not only run for himself, he had carried proof for men who could no longer run. The first tag belonged to one of the men rescued from the culvert. The second belonged to a man listed missing on the chalkboard. The third matched a name crossed out on the torn list from the road. Every object on the table began connecting to another witness, another place, another hidden act. The Americans sent a patrol to the last location written with the third tag, a ruined orchard shed behind the village school. There they found a German soldier hidden beneath a broken cart, alive, feverish, and holding a small pencil stub he had used to carve names into the wood above him. When brought back, the orchard survivor identified the stiff-collared officer by his cigarette case and the field policeman by the notebook chain hanging from his belt. He also said that some regular German soldiers had secretly helped marked men escape toward American lines. That statement reversed the prisoner crowd. Until then, the surrendering men had looked isolated and hunted. Now ordinary German prisoners began stepping forward to identify safe paths, hidden tags, and officers who had tried to block surrender routes. The fear was still there, but it no longer moved in one direction. One older German sergeant admitted he had cut rank patches from fleeing men so field police would not identify their units. He produced a bundle of torn patches from inside a stovepipe and placed them on the table. The same missing patches had made the first runner look like a deserter without a history. The stiff-collared officer tried to call the sergeant a traitor, but the interpreter was still recording. The lieutenant ordered the officer's words added beside the punishment categories, showing that the same label was used against anyone who helped the wounded, the frightened, or the surrendered. The strongest reversal came when the identity tags from the pouch led to a hidden group of 4 men in an abandoned cellar beneath a bakery. They had been fed by villagers for 2 days while waiting for a safe route to American custody. When MPs opened the cellar, the men raised their hands and asked the same question first, whether they would be sent back. They were not sent back. They were processed one by one, given medical cards, and placed in protected barracks away from officers and field police. The witnesses who had once crawled through ditches now stood behind wire under American guard, while the men who called them cowards stood isolated. By sunset, the reversal was complete. The soldiers who begged to be taken prisoner had not broken under fear. They had carried names, tags, routes, warnings, and witnesses through a collapsing army that wanted them silent. The final irreversible event began during a night search of the stiff-collared officer's baggage. An MP found a false bottom inside his map case, and under it lay a sealed order marked for retreat discipline, signed by 3 officers and stamped by a field police unit. The order instructed German officers to prevent unauthorized surrender by removing identity tags, marking unreliable men, and reporting missing soldiers as lost during shelling. It also named roads where soldiers were most likely to run toward American lines, including the ditch road from the opening surrender. The order was read aloud under floodlights while protected witnesses stood behind an MP line. Every place named in the document now had evidence attached to it: the barn, the orchard, the culvert, the bakery cellar, and the forest road where the first shots had been fired. A second search team returned to the barn and dug beneath the feeding trough. They found a buried metal box containing more tags, letters never delivered, and photographs taken of men before punishment. Several witnesses identified faces in the photographs, including 2 men still missing. The youngest wounded soldier recognized one photograph and began striking the bed rail until the medic brought the interpreter. He said the man in the picture had been moved toward a drainage trench beyond the cemetery after refusing to join the punishment squad. A rescue party reached the trench before dawn and found the missing man alive under loose boards, too weak to move but still breathing. He carried no tag, but his name was carved into the inside of his boot by another prisoner who feared the officers would erase him. That final rescue closed the last open mark on the chalkboard. The missing name board was taken down carefully, not erased, and carried into the command office as evidence. The names were copied into the official record under American supervision. The stiff-collared officer made one final attempt to defend the system. He said no army could survive if frightened men ran to the enemy. The lieutenant ordered the statement written beneath the order that removed identity tags from men who wanted to live. The final prisoner order was issued before sunrise. Every German arrival from that sector would be processed individually. All field police would be isolated. All officer authority over surrendering enlisted men was suspended, and any prisoner requesting protection would be moved before German leaders could see him. The first runner from the ditch was brought to the gate as the punishment squad was loaded into guarded trucks. He watched the field policeman climb into a vehicle alone, without lists, without a notebook, and without the power to point any man back toward the forest. The final irreversible moment came when the rescued men walked through the gate into protected custody by name, not as deserters and not as missing numbers. The order was nailed beside the entrance, and no German officer could again claim the right to take a surrendering man back before American processing. The soldiers had begged to be taken prisoner because surrender had become the only door their own officers could not close. By morning, that door was guarded, recorded, and protected by evidence no one could bury in a ditch. The next morning, the first runner stood beside the camp gate while the evidence truck carried the hidden tags, punishment order, photographs, ropes, and missing name board toward headquarters. The wounded boy watched from the infirmary window as the protected men received new medical cards one by one. No one returned them to the forest road, and no officer could cross out their names again, because the men who begged for captivity had finally reached a place where their surrender was recorded as survival. Most people know how World War II ended. Very few know what happened inside these prison camps. Subscribe for more untold WWII stories.